This is the Great War. This is where everything ends. This is streaming versus native. This is Hades versus Hades. Thank you for joining me today. We are here to see if a streaming experience can outdo a native experience, and that's why we are doing Hades versus Hades. We are doing Hades on xCloud versus Hades on Switch, and for me this was an important comparison because, for one, xCloud is now available on both iOS and Android, and Hades is one of the few games that's available on both. I also have Octopath Traveler as well, but I chose Hades because it's a game where the controls are very tight and input lag can really kill the experience. So I thought this was a really good place to test how good xCloud actually is. Now I'll be testing both the mobile version of xCloud versus Switch and handheld mode, and xCloud on desktop running in Chrome versus a dock switch, just to kind of see what the differences are. Because I look at it like this: maybe someone's thinking about getting a Switch and they want to play specific games on mobile that are on Game Pass, so it's important to test the mobile part. But maybe someone just doesn't have a game system altogether and they're also just considering not getting a game system and just using xCloud, so I thought it was important to test both. Another reason I'm doing this comparison was my personal curiosity, because Game Pass, even though it's streaming, is running it on Series X hardware now, which is a lot more powerful than the Switch, so I wanted to see what the differences are. And right off the bat, even the loading screens, there's a huge difference. Now, when I did the intro cut, I sped up the footage on the Switch to make them basically the same speed so I could just do that cool intro. But in real life, yeah, it's a lot longer to load into the game on the Switch than on xCloud. So that's another reason I thought it was an interesting comparison. Also, when Hades came out, there were some performance complaints, so we'll also get into that later in the video. Before we hop into the comparison, I want to go over the hardware I'm using first. So I'm using the iPhone 12 paired with the Razer Kishi over Wi-Fi. I have a gigabit connection and the access point is in the same room as my phone. Of course, with the Switch, I'm just using the second generation upgraded, better battery life Switch. And then for the desktop comparison with xCloud running on Chrome, I am just running a computer. The specs don't matter that much since it's streaming, but I have a Ryzen 7 3700X, a 2080 Ti, 32 gigs of RAM, and I'm directly hardwired over Ethernet, again 1 gigabit connection, and I was using the Xbox Elite Controller 2. Now the first comparison I want to get into is Switch docked versus xCloud streaming through a browser. Now this comparison actually surprised me quite a bit because I had never really tried xCloud or any streaming services in a browser, because for me, I think one of the main advantages of having the streaming service was playing it on the go. But like I mentioned earlier, there might be someone that's just looking to maybe not buy a console or gaming PC and they still want to play games. So I do feel like it was important to test it. And Hades is not a too graphically intensive game. It is very sensitive to input lag. So I kind of did some button presses on the Switch just to see how it felt natively. And then I did the same thing when I was playing the xCloud version, and I was surprised. The xCloud version on desktop browser was very good. There were a few times where it stuttered, like I heard audio stutters, but overall, like, it was really close to the native experience. Like if I took somebody and set them down and was like, hey, try this game, and they didn't know what they were playing it on, they probably wouldn't know. Like I don't think the average person would notice. The biggest thing that you would notice as far as the streaming version would just be the artifacting. It's especially apparent when the screen's fully black. Here you can definitely see artifacts, but the experience was pretty seamless. Also, as far as the Xbox controller, I was connecting it wirelessly, but I'm using the USB adapter that connects over RF, so I'm not using Bluetooth, so that probably would reduce some of the latency. So if you're using like a Bluetooth controller, there might be a little bit more latency on desktop, but you can also just use a wired controller as well if you want to try to like eliminate the most latency possible. And then I don't want to boast too much about xCloud without talking about the Switch. As far as the Switch, like yeah, it's pretty seamless. The game runs really well on the Switch in dock mode. There were a few performance complaints about the Switch in handheld mode, but as far as I can see in dock mode, I didn't run into any, and I've definitely run into them on the Switch. Not that they're a big deal. There's usually like maybe like a half a second micro stutter, nothing that would really mess your game up. But in dock mode, it ran smooth. Like both of them were really good, and it's kind of a toss-up really. Like The Switch does look better visual-wise just because it's running natively. You don't have the artifacting that you get from streaming video, but the load times are faster on xCloud just because it's run off that Series X hardware. And in this case, the load times don't matter as much because after the initial load, the load times throughout the game aren't as long. Let's say in a scenario where you have something that's more graphically intensive, like let's say Tony Hawk Remaster comes to xCloud, and then you're comparing that to the Switch version, that might actually be an advantage with that better hardware. With this game, both versions actually look really good, so it's kind of a toss-up. I really have to give it to both. Like, if you have a Switch and you're curious about the xCloud version, you're probably fine. And if you have xCloud and you don't want to buy a system, that's the only service you have, then you're fine either way. So now I want to hop into the comparison between xCloud on mobile and the native Switch version. Now, one of the things that's kind of cool about the xCloud version is it does support cross-save. So I actually didn't die on my run on the PC version on purpose because I wanted to see how seamlessly the cross-save worked. And I was able to just hop back in and start back at the beginning of the main level that I was on. But the autosave in Hades, though, is like no problem. Of course, with the Switch, you just have everything on your Switch. So whether you're playing handheld, taking it with you, or docked, you don't really have to worry as much about the save. But I'd say xCloud is really good as well. So that's kind of a point for both. Like if you're concerned about save transfers, of course with xCloud, it's mostly going to depend on the game if they support cross saves. But a lot of the games on xCloud and Game Pass in general do. Now let's hop into the Switch version first. Going back to the Switch version, which was the original version, the OG version that I played, I forgot how good it was. Like, I remember reading about the performance issues and then me taking some time away from it and playing the Xbox version. I was like, oh man, the Switch version is nowhere near as good. And then I hopped back into the Switch version and I was like, actually, yeah, the Switch version is really good. What was I talking about? I was over exaggerating. But I'm really actually impressed by the Switch version. And you forget that the Switch has a 720p screen because it's small enough where it looks really good. It still looks good. It runs fantastic aside from when the action gets too heavy and you might notice a few micro stutters. But like I said earlier, it's not enough to really prevent you from enjoying the game. I think the biggest thing for me was just the controls on the Switch. I don't like the thumbsticks as much. I do way better using either the Switch Pro controller or just a Xbox controller. The Joy-Cons, not the best way to play this game. I actually enjoy the Razer Kishi a little bit more than the Joy-Cons just because the thumbsticks feel better, but that's just me personally. But also it's a Switch, so you can kind of buy whatever Joy-Cons you want. They make the Hori grip pad for the Switch that I heard is really good as well. So that's just a problem that can be fixed by just simply replacing the Joy-Cons. But yeah, other than that, the Switch version is great to play handheld. And the one advantage that it has over most phones is the aspect ratio of the screen. So I noticed when hopping over to the xCloud version, you're kind of stuck with a picture in the middle of the screen because most games aren't made to be played in a smartphone aspect ratio unless they're smartphone games. So you lose a bunch of width and then you're restricted to the height of your phone. So having something like a Switch, a dedicated gaming machine, I mean, the phone still looks really good. Like obviously my phone is OLED and it's way higher resolution. And even when the OLED Switch comes out, it's probably still not going to be as bright of a screen as you get on your phone. But I think given the size of the Switch screen in comparison to most phones and the fact that it's streaming anyway, they kind of both equally looked as good, but it was definitely more enjoyable to play on the Switch just because it was bigger, it's easier to see text. Going to the xCloud version, at first it was pretty good. Like there is definitely some input lag that I noticed. Like it wasn't enough where like I was pressing the button and I immediately noticed that it was off, but it just feels a little bit off. And I did not feel that when I was playing xCloud on the desktop. So I still think mobile has a little bit of work. And even back when I tried xCloud on Android, I still felt the same way. Like there's just something that's a little bit off. And the reason I even use the Razer Kishi is because this controller connects directly into the Lightning port. It's not Bluetooth or anything. It's powered off of the phone and it transfers data directly. So I wanted to take away as much input lag as possible. But even then, it still just didn't feel exactly right. And then after 10 minutes of playing, I just started hitting these huge lag spikes that again, that I didn't experience on desktop at all. And I played each version for about half an hour each. So after like 10 minutes, I was like, yeah, this is pretty much unplayable. And it would be okay sometimes, and then it would just be like super laggy. And even before like I was recording this video, there's times where I was at work on 5G and I started playing Hades, And it was really good. Like, I had no issues. I was playing for like 20 minutes and I was like, wow, this is a really good experience. And then sometimes it's complete crap. So the story right now on mobile is that it's a very inconsistent experience. Like, when it's good, it's still not as good as a native experience. And when it's bad, it's really bad. Now, the one thing I will say as far as visuals, I did notice, like, playing on the phone, that the picture was pretty close to the Switch because you don't notice the artifacting as much on a smaller screen like a cell phone screen. So I will give it that. Picture quality was pretty good. xCloud right now is only 720p. They plan on going up to 1080p by the end of the year, but hopefully they get some of their stuff in line as far as these issues with the random lag spots. Right now, I'd say like the browser experience for xCloud is pretty good. I think if you just wanted the subscription to play some games in the browser, it'd probably be worth it. The handheld experience isn't good enough to compete with the Switch at all. The Switch is still the definitive king, and we'll have to reevaluate once the Steam Deck comes out and once the streaming gets better. There hasn't been a streaming service that I've tried where I've been like, this is good enough to replace a native experience, and I've tried all of them so far. They've all been good, and I think like if you're playing something like a strategy game or like something like The Sims, they're more than good enough to do that. But I think action game and online multiplayer games are where they really struggle at. So the Switch still has its place. I think overall, to me, xCloud still feels like a bonus for Game Pass versus its own service, but I am very hopeful about the future of xCloud. So that's my thought on Hades versus Hades, xCloud versus the Switch. Let me know what you guys think. I will be back for another sensational Sunday. But if you enjoyed this video, then make sure to subscribe because I'm always here every Sunday and Wednesday, and I'm always dropping news videos, doing all kinds of crazy stuff, like telling you to remember to do at least 2 things at the same time. Peace.